The number one thing people think that determines whether they're ready to retire is their number. If you hit your number, you're ready to retire. If you haven't hit your number yet, you're not. Well, after working with hundreds of people through their own retirement transitions, I can tell you that the number is only one piece of the puzzle, and honestly, it's not even the most telling one. There are people out there sitting on $2 million that aren't even close to being ready to retire yet, and at the same time, there are others with $900,000 saved who are completely ready to retire. They just don't know it yet. The difference shows up in ways that most retirement calculators are never going to capture. And the signs that I'm going to walk you through today, a lot of them have nothing to do with your balance at all. A few of them might actually surprise you. If you find yourself nodding along with some of these signs, that's probably not a coincidence. And if you want to learn more about how these signs apply to your own specific personal situation, there's a link in the description. You can book a call with my team. We're happy to chat with you about it. The first sign that you already have enough to retire is that your funded ratio is at least 100%. The funded ratio is a pretty helpful metric, and it compares the total value of your future retirement spending to how much money you have saved in the bank already. So basically, you take the present value of all that future spending you think you're going to have throughout your retirement years, and you compare it to your savings. And if you have more saved up already than what you think you're going to need to spend throughout retirement, well, you're probably in a pretty good starting place. If you have less saved than what you're going to need to spend in retirement, you might have some ground to make up. So in a nutshell, the funded ratio tells you how much of your future spending needs are covered by your current savings. And any ratio over 100% means that you have more saved already than what you're going to need to spend in the future. It also means that you're probably ready to step into retirement. You have more in the bank than what you're going to need to spend in the future. Technically, you're financially independent, and you might be able to afford to give up your income from your job, make that retirement transition because you already have enough banked to last you the rest of your life. Now, simple example, let's say that we have someone named John who's 65 years old. He's about to retire, and we're going to plan for a 35-year retirement window. So John wants to spend $10,000 per month throughout retirement, including taxes, and he has a Social Security benefit coming in each month of $3,500. Well, his income gap is $6,500 in that case. That $3,500 of guaranteed Social Security income means that's $3,500 less that he has to take out of his accounts. So, to determine his income gap, we're going to take his $10,000 spending need minus the guaranteed income of $3,500, meaning he needs to pull $6,500 a month out of his savings and his investments and his retirement portfolio. So if John lives for 35 years in retirement and we assume a 3% inflation rate, plug all these numbers into my financial calculator, what I get is a present value of future spending needs not covered by Social Security totaling $1,688,969. So what that means is if John has a retirement portfolio of $1.5 million, he's less than 100% funded. He doesn't yet have all of his future expenses covered by current savings. But if he has a portfolio of $2 million, he has enough saved to pay for the present value of all those future expenses. He's probably going to be in fine shape. So the funded ratio is a helpful starting point, but it's got a lot of flaws too, right? So if we use the funding ratio on its own, anything over 100% is good. It means that you have all your future expenses covered by what's in the bank right now. And in John's example, we calculated that present value using just the rate of inflation. Well, for most of us, we're going to have our retirement portfolio in some kind of diversified portfolio, maybe stocks and bonds and other stuff, that probably earns us a rate of return greater than the rate of inflation over a long-term period of time. So that would imply that if we're using a 3% inflation rate to calculate the present value of John's future expenses, that he might be able to be less than 100% funded if he's earning more than 3% on his retirement portfolio over the course of his retirement, because he can use those returns to make up some ground. On the other hand, we also don't know how long John's going to live. We're planning for a 35-year retirement. He might only make it 10 years. He might live to 110. We don't know. We also don't know precisely what his spending is going to look like decade by decade. Generally, we spend less the older that we get. John will probably spend less money in the year he turns 95 than he does in the year he turns 75, but we don't know that. We don't know what his future medical expenses are going to look like or long-term care needs might be. So the funded ratio is helpful, but it's not perfect and it does have a few flaws. The second sign that you're ready to retire already is that your income gap is manageable. So that example we were just going through, John had an income gap of $6,500. He needed to spend $10,000 a month throughout retirement, including taxes. He had $3,500 a month of Social Security coming in. That makes his income gap, or what his savings needs to support, $6,500 per month. Now, just like the funded ratio, the income gap doesn't tell you the whole picture. There might be someone out there that has a $20,000 monthly income gap that is completely manageable given their situation, and then somebody else that has a $2,500 monthly income gap that is going to completely blow up their retirement plan. We need to view income gaps not just on their own, but relative to the size of the assets supporting them. So let's go through a different example. Let's say instead of John, we now have Susan. Susan needs to spend $7,000 per month in retirement. Her Social Security benefit is coming in at $2,800 a month. That makes her income gap $4,200 per month. And if we multiply that by 12 to get an annual figure, that works out to be $50,400 per year. So to figure out whether or not this is a sustainable income gap, we need to look at the size of Susan's balance sheet, her investment and retirement portfolio. The larger her portfolio, the more likely it is that she can sustain that income gap. So if Susan's retirement portfolio is $2 million, well, $50,400 is only 2.52% of $2 million. If it's only $1.5 million, $50,400 is 3.36%. $1 million, 5.04%. And if she only has $500,000, $50,400 of income gap represents about 10% of her retirement portfolio. So the larger the portion of our portfolio that our income gap represents, the less sustainable the whole plan is going to look. Now, you may have heard of the 4% retirement distribution rule of thumb. That says that the safe withdrawal rate is 4%. So if you have a retirement income gap that represents more than 4% of your portfolio, that might mean trouble. That's a reasonable starting place. The threshold I like to start with is maybe 4 or 5% depending on the circumstances. In Susan's case, if she has $500,000 saved up and she wants to take 10% out of it every single year in order to make up that $50,400 income gap, I would not feel very good at all about her chances of not running out of money 20 and 30 years down the road, because history just hasn't supported that, regardless of the returns you might get in your portfolio. Now, there's a psychological function to this too. So the larger our income gap as a portion of our savings, the more tenuous the plan is, and we like to keep that under like 4 or 5% wherever we can. But there's a psychological component too. So even though there are situations out there where someone has a $20,000 monthly income gap that might be completely manageable, the larger the dollar amount of your income gap, the scarier it is psychologically, because you know that the more your investment savings needs to support over an indeterminate retirement period. We don't know how long we're going to live. We don't know what the market's going to do. There are a lot of unknowns here. The larger your income gap, the more of your future spending needs are not going to be covered from guaranteed sources, and that's a psychological factor we need to be aware of and comfortable with before retiring. The third sign is that you can weather a really bad market in year one of retirement. So bear markets happen pretty frequently. Historically, they happen every 6 to 10 to 12 years, something in that range. So if we're planning for a 30, 35-year retirement or longer, we have to expect that we're going to go through a couple of these bad market periods over the course of our retirement timeline. And mathematically, the worst time that that bear market can happen is right after we stop working, because that's the period where we have the longest amount of time in front of us. That's probably the period where we have the most at stake in the largest retirement portfolio, and mathematically, it's simply the hardest to overcome. This whole concept is called sequence of returns risk. If we have a decent idea of the range of returns we might get in our investment accounts over a 30-year period, the sequence of returns risk is that we get the very worst ones first. So in practice, the way that this works is we step into retirement, we have our retirement portfolio invested. Well, if we hit one of those bad bear markets, that's psychologically very, very hard to go through. It puts into question whether our retirement plan is sound and whether our retirement savings is large enough to last us the rest of our lives after watching it shrink because of a bad period. That being said, this is precisely why we put bonds in the portfolio, not just for diversification purposes, because bonds are different than stocks and typically when stocks zig, bonds tend to zag, but because if we can keep at least 3 or 4 years of our living expenses in bonds, that simply gives our stocks more time to recover if we hit that bad period in the markets right after we retire. The reason that's important is historically, bear markets don't typically last for longer than 3 or 4 years. By the end of year 3, almost every single bear market on record has resolved itself and recovered to where the stock market was previously. The only exception to that is the Great Depression back in 1929, and that was before we had the SEC, the FDIC, the SIPC, the modern market environment that we're in today with a whole lot of different investor-related protections. So here's an example. Let's say that you have a retirement portfolio of $1 million. You've decided that you want to invest everything in stocks. I think we can probably agree that that might not be a good idea for most people transitioning into retirement, maybe not for everybody. And you need to take out $50,000 a year from your portfolio. Well, you transition into retirement, the market falls by 25%. You hit one of those bad market years. So now your $1 million is down to $750,000. And then you take the $50,000 out. On top of that, now you're down to $700,000 in year 1. Well, the alternative here would be, well, what if you kept 4 years of those distributions that you need to take out every single year in bonds, right? So $50,000 a year, 4 years of that implies about $200,000 in short and medium term bonds, with the other $800,000 invested in stocks. This leaves you with an asset allocation of 80% stocks, 20% bonds. So if the stock market falls right after you retire, that $800,000 loses a quarter of its value. Now you're down to $600,000 in the portfolio. Hopefully the bonds remain relatively stable. It's a different asset class. They tend to be more stable over time, especially the short and medium term ones. Basically, you can just take your $50,000 of distributions every year from the bond holdings and simply allow that $600,000 of stocks more time to recover. Because again, historically, bear markets don't typically take more than 3 or 4 years to rebound and get back to where they were previously. This sign isn't about having more money, it's about having the right structure. Someone with $800,000 in a war chest may be way better off than somebody with $1.2 million in savings, but no downside protection. You'll know whether you pass this sign because you'll know precisely how many years of living expenses you have sitting in the bond portion of your portfolio. And if the number is more than about 3 or 4 years, you pass and you're probably in reasonably good shape to start with. The fourth sign is that you've stopped trying to optimize and you've started to think about your life. Now, this is the first psychological sign that we're going to cover, the first of a few psychological signs that we're going to cover. And I can always tell when people are there because the questions that they start to ask, they change a little bit with regard to their framework and where they come from. When people start to make this mindset shift, I can always tell because the questions that they ask, they just change a little bit. We're going from accumulation mode to distribution mode. And the mindset shift is a change from thinking and focusing on all the minutia, all the math, all these little minor details that have gone into the plan. And the focus broadens more to what do I really want to do with the rest of my life? Where do I want to age? Where do I want to spend my energy and my focus? Who do I want to spend the most time with? And when that change happens, it's a psychological sign that you're getting a lot more ready to retire. On top of that, when people start to make this change, in conversation you can kind of tell because they start to loosen up. They've been over the numbers. They know the math of their plan cold. They have some degree of confidence. And for so long, they've been putting more money into their retirement accounts. They've been saving in the accumulation phase to at one point in the future be able to retire. Well, now they know they're there. They know the math. It's a release of this pent up energy and need to save for so long, so many years across the course of their career. This is a change you should pay attention to because when you have that release of energy, it's a pretty good sign that you're becoming mentally prepared for the transition of giving up your routine every day, giving up the mental challenge of the career, the social interaction, just the general routine of getting up, having a task to go do, doing that task, and having your identity being wrapped up in. When you see that change in yourself, you loosen up, you start thinking broader, you don't have as much pressure to save and accumulate. That's a pretty good sign. And that brings me to the fifth sign, and that's the biggest source of your financial anxiety has changed. During your career, during the accumulation phase, it's save. And for most people, the anxiety sits in Am I saving enough? Am I doing enough now to put myself in a position to where I can actually leave the job at some point in the future and have savings enough to last me the rest of my life and enable me to do the things that I want to do? That's the main source of anxiety. Well, when you feel a change in the source of that anxiety from whether you're saving enough to whether you're actually spending enough, am I leaving too much meat on this bone? Am I spending too little? That's a pretty good sign too, and it's sign number 5 in our video today. Now, this kind of anxiety during your accumulating years can actually be a good thing, right? When we save, when we feel the need to save, I should say, that can induce us to save more. And I'm guessing that if you're watching this video, you're probably in a better position today if you've had that feeling years ago, because it might have caused you to save more, and now you're in a better position. And that's really the whole point of saving, right? Is to give the future version of yourself more options when you get there, because we don't know precisely what the path is going to look like for us. We're just trying to keep as many doors open as we possibly can by saving more today so that we have it available to us tomorrow. From a math perspective, that's when you know you've hit this inflection point. If your funded ratio goes well above 100%, if you find yourself at maybe 125% or greater, well, you have more than you're probably going to need based on the definition of that metric. That might be okay with you if you want to leave a big bequest to a person or a group of people, family members or organizations or what have you, but a lot of us are coming to the conclusion that we want to use those resources that we've worked so hard to squirrel away during our accumulation years, often driven by some fear and anxiety. We want to use those resources while we're still alive. And if you have a funded ratio of well over 125%, you might find yourself in that situation too. That being said, we should recognize that this is not always an easy mindset shift to make. We've been taught our entire lives that we need to spend a little bit less than we make. We need to save a little bit for our futures, right? That's ingrained in us by the time we get to the end of our careers. So this mindset shift between am I saving enough to am I spending enough, that's a completely different skill set, spending down the money. It's completely foreign to us. So don't feel strange if you haven't gotten there quite yet, because it is a big transition. Now, if you're watching this and you're starting to wonder whether your plan is actually set up the right way, not just the balance piece of it, the psychology, but income, tax, the investments, the distribution, the order of withdrawals, this is the type of stuff that my team and I talk about all day, every single day. There's a link in the description to this video. Feel free to click it, book a call with our team. We're happy to talk through your personal situation. The 6th sign is that you've run the numbers so many times, you already know the outcome. Now, the math is obviously important, right? We want to have a lot of quantitative confidence that your nest egg, your investment retirement portfolio is large enough to last you for the rest of your life. And there are definitely some quantitative checks that we want to check off, that we want to go through along the way to verify that. But at some point, this exercise becomes redundant. And if you've run the numbers so many times that you already know the outcome of some minor tweak or some adjustment in some minor variable or nuance, well, that's a pretty good sign. Probably know a lot about the inputs and the assumptions and everything going into your retirement model. And if you get to the point where you know how one little change is going to impact the outcome, that's a good sign. Now, sometimes what will happen is people who are getting closer and closer to their retirement will continue running the numbers over and over and over and over again, but it's out of anxiety as opposed to sincere curiosity, right? Our emotions, our psychology play just a huge part in the decisions that we make with our money, and it's a big change going from your career to your retirement years. Now, if you're running the numbers over and over again because of anxiety, you'll probably know that, because before you start the exercise, you'll have a little bit of a pit in your stomach because you're concerned about the outcome. And on top of that, you'll already have a pretty good idea of what the outcome is going to be before you start running the numbers again for the umpteenth time. So if that's you, just recognize that you're running the numbers out of anxiety because of uncertainty about what the future holds, as opposed to curiosity about whether or not you're ready to retire, to give up your day job and live the rest of your life off of your savings. The final sign you're ready to retire right now is that you know what you're retiring to, not just what you're retiring from. This is probably the most important sign, and it has nothing to do with the spreadsheets. It has nothing to do with the software or the math. It's purely psychological and qualitative as opposed to quantitative. The reason this is so important is we've all met people who have stepped into retirement because they were retiring from something. They were burned out in their career. They were not happy with what they were doing on a day-to-day basis. They were just putting their head down and going to work because it's what they had to do until they had enough in the accounts, in the retirement savings accounts and so forth, to be able to stop working and live the rest of their life comfortably. But they retired into the void. They didn't know what they were retiring to. They were just hoping that the future was better than the drudgery that they were forcing themselves through in the latter parts of their career. And what happens when we retire into the void and we don't have our social circles set up? We don't have a routine. We don't have any challenge mentally or physically. We don't have any purpose to get up and get out of bed and solve problems and do the stuff that often comes with career life. Well, you start deteriorating immediately. And I'm sure that everybody watching this video knows someone and has seen this happen. When you retire into the void, you start deteriorating immediately, both physically and mentally, and depression sets in sooner than you might think. Now, the reason that this one's so important, obviously your mental health is important. You want to set yourself up for long-term mental health, and we want to avoid depression and so forth. Of course, that's important. But more so, when it comes to our financial decision-making, when you know where you want to be, who you want to spend time with, what your weeks are going to look like, what your social interactions are going to look like, all of the above, that's what drives your decision making with regard to the quantitative stuff. That should be the stuff that informs when you file for Social Security, when you take money out of which account, how the tax strategy looks like, what your portfolio should look like. If you don't have any of that context or foundation or background informing those items, you're really shooting in the dark, and it's impossible to make a sound, rational decision because there's just thousands and thousands of different options. When it's guided by what you're retiring to, when you have that framework set up already, it's far easier to make a sound and rational decision that's good for you both now and over the rest of your retirement. We had a client years ago who was in the healthcare industry, and he was just burned out. He was ready to retire. He'd been just completely spent over a better part of a decade, but he wasn't quite ready to retire. He had to keep going into work. He had to earn, a few more years of paychecks, make a couple more years of 401k contributions before he was really in a place to where he could afford to retire. And he really disliked it. It was total drudgery. Like I say, he was completely burned out, but we made a plan. We made it work, right? Well, he was retiring from something and didn't feel that it was that important to set up what his life, what his week-to-week, day-to-day life was going to look like after he quit his job. So finally he got to the point where he had enough money in the accounts to where this made sense. We had a decent plan that would work quantitatively. So he quit his job, he retired, he spent the first 4 weeks of his retirement traveling. Then he came back and just kind of sat around there. He sat on the couch, watched TV, I went and played golf here and there, but he had no routine, he had no structure, he had no idea what he was retiring to. He had to build all that stuff up from scratch. And by month 3 of retirement, he was already depressed, and it could have spiraled out of control on him. Fortunately, he made the really wise decision to go out and just get some part-time job for some more social interaction, and that way he could rebuild his routines and figure out what the rest of his life was going to look like. But it really could have spiraled out of control had he not intervened at that point. Yes, the money is the foundation, but your life is the point. And as we all go through this transition, we need to figure out what we really want out of our lives with the time we have left on earth, because that needs to inform the money part. You do the money part first and you just kind of skip over the life part. For a lot of us, that's the harder work, but it's a really empty feeling. It's very easy to get depressed and have an unfulfilling retirement if we don't figure that stuff out first. So here's what I want you to do next. I want you to go back over each of these 7 signs that we talked about in this video and determine how many of them you've checked off so far. Not just the financial ones, all 7 of them. Because in my experience, the ones who are truly ready to retire already start living their lives like they will when they're retired while they're still working. And these psychological checks are often the first ones that are checked off before the financial ones even come into the picture. So go back over, check off all 7 signs, and evaluate where you're at. Now, in practice, what I've experienced is a lot of people have these signs checked off. They step into retirement. They're in pretty good shape. A lot of them have plenty of money, $1 million or more saved up, and they're in a pretty good position. But then they get into trouble by the time they're in their mid to late 70s. Not for the reasons that you think, not because they hit a bad market or made some huge mistake, but it's something quieter than that. I walk through exactly what that is, how it happens, and how you can avoid it in the next video here. I'll cue it up right now. I would suggest you watch this one next.